The blizzard didn't care that Maylene Chen was already dying. Wind tore through her thin silk dress, the one she'd worn to meet a husband who'd promised her a new life in America, as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, bare feet leaving bloody prints behind her. Behind her, somewhere in that white hell, Barrett Cain's men were hunting. Ahead, nothing but wilderness and the certainty of freezing to death. Then, a miracle or a mirage, a single light flickered through the storm. A ranch house. Salvation or just another trap, she couldn't know. But her legs were already carrying her toward it, because even a slim chance at survival beat certain death in Cain's bed. If you're watching from somewhere in this big world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Maylin's story travels. And if her fight for survival moves you, hit that like button. Now let's see if that light in the darkness leads to hope, or something far more dangerous. The storm had teeth. Maylene had learned this in the 3 hours since she'd fled the settlement. 3 hours that felt like 3 lifetimes. Each gust of wind bit through the delicate fabric of her dress, the beautiful jade green silk she'd worn with such hope 6 months ago when she'd stepped off the ship in San Francisco. That girl seemed like a stranger now. That girl had believed in promises. Her feet had gone numb 20 minutes ago, which she supposed was a mercy. The pain had been excruciating before that. Every step on frozen ground sending lightning through her legs. Now there was just a distant, dull sensation, like her feet belonged to someone else. She knew what that meant. She'd seen frostbite before, on the ship coming across the Pacific. A sailor had lost 3 toes. Better to lose toes than what Barrett Cain intended to take from her. The memory of his voice made her move faster, even as her body screamed for rest. Your husband's debt don't die with him, China girl. $2,300. And since you got no money, I'll take payment in other ways. His smile had shown too many teeth, like the storm. His hand on her arm had been hot enough to burn through her sleeve. She'd run that same night. Stupid, probably. Suicidal, certainly. It was December in Wyoming territory, and the blizzard had been building all day. Every person in the settlement, all 37 souls in that collection of rough buildings that barely deserved to be called a town, had been preparing to weather it indoors. Boarding windows, stocking firewood, battening down for what the old-timers said would be a 3-day blow. And Maylene had run straight into it wearing a silk dress and cloth slippers. But she'd seen Cain's eyes. She'd heard the finality in his voice. He owned the general store, the saloon, the freight company. He owned the marshal, who wouldn't be marshal without Cain's money backing him. In that settlement, Cain's word was law, and he'd decided Maylene was his property now. So she'd waited until the house he'd locked her in grew quiet, until she heard his men drinking in the next room, celebrating their boss's acquisition. She'd pried open the back window, thanked the ancestors her husband had taught her to use American tools before he died, and she'd dropped into the snow and run. North, because south led back to the settlement. East, because west was deeper wilderness. North meant ranches, scattered and lonely, but ranches nonetheless. North meant people, maybe. North meant a chance. The wind drove ice crystals into her face like needles. She couldn't feel her hands anymore. They hung at her sides, useless, the fingers curled into claws she couldn't straighten. Her dress clung to her legs, the silk heavy with ice, each step requiring her to tear the fabric free from where it had frozen to her skin. She was going to die out here. The thought came with surprising clarity, cutting through the exhausted fog in her mind. This was how it ended. Frozen in the wilderness of a country she'd never wanted to come to, fleeing a debt she'd never agreed to, mourning a husband she'd barely known. Yanhong had seemed kind when they'd met through the marriage broker in Canton. He'd written letters or paid someone to write them, describing his successful dry goods business in America, the house he was building, the life they would share. Maylene's parents, desperate to ensure their daughter's future as famine gripped their province, had accepted his offer. The bride price he'd sent had fed their family for months. She'd discovered the truth 3 days after landing in San Francisco. There was no dry goods business. Jian Hong was a laborer, deep in debt to Barrett Cain, who'd loaned him the money for the bride price, the ship passage, everything. Jian Hong had gambled that a wife would motivate him to work harder, earn more, dig himself out of the hole. Instead, he died in a mining accident 6 weeks later, and the hole had swallowed Maylene instead. Her foot caught on something buried in the snow, a root, a rock. and she went down hard. The impact drove what little air remained from her lungs. She lay there, cheek pressed to the snow, and felt the cold seeping into her bones. It would be easy to just stop, to let the storm take her, to sleep. No. The word came from somewhere deep, somewhere that still contained a spark of the girl who'd left Canton with hope in her heart. The girl who'd survived the ship voyage when 3 other women had died of fever. The girl who'd kept going after Jianhong's death, who'd worked in the settlement's laundry for pennies, who'd tried so desperately to find a way forward. That girl didn't give up. Maylene pushed herself to her hands and knees, then to her feet. The world spun. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, just endless white, endless wind, endless cold. She picked a direction and walked, one step, another, another. Her mind began to drift, untethered from the frozen shell of her body. She thought of her mother's garden in Canton, the way the jasmine had smelled in summer. She thought of her little brother, who would be 12 now, who she'd never see again. She thought of the ocean, which had seemed impossibly vast when she'd crossed it, but which was nothing compared to the emptiness she felt now. She thought of warmth. That's when she saw the light. At first, she was certain it was a hallucination. People saw things when they froze to death, she knew. Visions, angels, the spirits of ancestors coming to guide you to the afterlife. The light was faint, golden, barely visible through the driving snow, but it was there, and it wasn't moving. Hope crashed through her chest like a physical blow. A light that didn't move meant a building. A building meant shelter. Shelter meant... She stumbled toward it, fear forgotten, caution abandoned. She didn't care if it was Cain's men, didn't care if it was bandits or wolves or demons. It was warmth and walls and a chance to not die in the snow, and that was enough. The light grew stronger as she drew closer. She could make out a shape now, a structure, low and solid. A ranch house, she thought, though her vision was blurring. A porch. She could see a porch. Her legs gave out 10 feet from the steps. She crawled, hands and knees, then just hands, dragging herself forward through the snow. Her fingers, she couldn't feel them, but they must still work, must still obey, found the first step. Then the second. The wood of the porch was solid beneath her, real, blessedly free of snow. She reached the door. With the last fragment of strength left in her body, Maylene raised her fist and pounded on the wood. 3 times. The sound was pathetically weak against the roar of the storm, but it was all she had. Then she collapsed, her cheek pressed against the rough planks of the porch, and waited to see if anyone would answer, or if she'd die here, 3 feet from salvation. The door opened. She couldn't lift her head to see who stood there, could only make out boots, worn leather, caked with mud and snow, and the hem of canvas trousers. A man's voice, deep and rough from disuse, spoke a single word that she barely heard over the wind. Christ. Then there were hands on her, lifting her, and the world tilted as she was carried across the threshold. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the wind's howl, and the sudden silence was so profound it hurt her ears. Warmth hit her like a wave, and with it came pain. Her hands, her feet, her face. Everything that had gone mercifully numb in the storm suddenly burned as if she'd been thrust into fire. She tried to cry out, but her jaw wouldn't work properly, frozen shut. Easy. The voice again, closer now. Don't fight it. Body's got to thaw. She was being set down near a stove. She could feel the heat radiating from cast iron, could smell wood smoke. Blankets appeared, rough wool that scraped against her frozen skin. The man moved with efficient purpose, wrapping her, adjusting her position so she faced the stove directly. Your feet, he said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. Concern? Anger? Hell, what were you thinking? She still couldn't speak, could barely think through the pain of thawing, but she managed to open her eyes, to focus on the man who'd saved her. He was kneeling beside her, and her first thought was that he looked carved from the same wood as his house, all hard angles and weathered planes. 40, maybe, or younger, but aged by harsh living. Dark hair shot through with gray, worn long enough to brush his collar. A beard that hadn't seen a barber in months. Eyes that were gray or blue, she couldn't tell in the lamplight, and deeply guarded. Those eyes met hers, and she saw him truly see her for the first time. His expression shifted, just slightly. Surprised, she thought. You're Chinese. It wasn't a question, and there was no judgment in his tone, just statement of fact, the way he might comment on the color of the sky. Maylene managed a tiny nod. He studied her for a moment longer, then stood and moved to the stove. She heard water being poured, metal scraping on metal. He returned with a cup, helped her sit up enough to drink. The liquid was lukewarm. Deliberately, she realized. Hot water on frozen flesh could cause damage. The tea tasted of nothing, but the warmth spreading down her throat was heaven. Small sips, he instructed, not too fast. She obeyed because she had no choice, because her body was still only partially under her control. Between sips, she took in her surroundings. The cabin was small. One main room with a sleeping loft visible above, a kitchen area in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies. Everything was orderly but worn, maintained through necessity rather than pride. A bachelor's home. A lonely home. No woman's touch anywhere. When the cup was empty, he took it from her hands. She'd managed to grip it, though her fingers felt thick and clumsy, and returned to the stove. This time he brought back a pot and a cloth, and without asking permission, he began working on her feet. The pain was extraordinary. As he cleaned away the snow and ice, as blood slowly returned to frozen tissue, Maylene bit down on the blanket to keep from screaming. She watched his face as he worked, saw the grim set of his jaw, the tight lines around his eyes. "Toes might be all right," he said after what felt like an eternity. "Maybe. Hard to say yet, but you'll keep your feet if we're lucky." "Thank you." Her voice was a croak, barely recognizable, but it worked. Words were possible again. He glanced up at her, surprise flickering across his features again. "You speak English?" "Yes." A pause to gather strength. "My husband taught me." "Where is he?" "Dead." The single word hung in the air between them. The man returned his attention to her feet, wrapping them carefully in clean cloth. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and regarded her with those unreadable gray-blue eyes. "You run from something," he said. "Not a question. No woman walks into a blizzard wearing a silk dress unless she's running." Maylene met his gaze. She could lie, should lie, probably, but something in his face, the weathered honesty of it, the lack of pretense, made her choose truth instead. "A man in the settlement, Barrett Cain. My husband owed him money. Cain says I must pay the debt." Understanding flickered in the rancher's eyes, followed by something darker. Anger, maybe, though it seemed directed elsewhere rather than at her. "And you chose the storm instead." "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "Smart. Men like that don't stop once they start taking." He stood, moved to a trunk against the wall, and returned with clothes. A shirt, wool pants, thick socks. "These'll be too big, but they're warm and dry. Can you manage yourself, or do you need help?" The question was asked matter-of-factly, without any hint of impropriety. Maylene realized he was offering simple practical assistance, nothing more. "I can manage." Her pride demanded that much, even if it was a lie. "I'll turn my back." "Take your time." He did exactly that, moving to stand by the window, staring out at the storm. Maylene struggled with the frozen fastenings of her dress, her fingers still clumsy and uncooperative. The jade silk, so beautiful once, purchased with money her family couldn't spare, peeled away from her skin in stiff folds. Beneath it, her undergarments were equally soaked. She stripped everything off, the cold air hitting her bare skin before she hurriedly pulled on the clothes he'd provided. The shirt hung on her like a tent. The pants required rolling up at the ankles and waist, but they were warm and dry, and that was worth more than gold. "I'm done." He turned back, assessed her with a quick glance, and nodded. "Better. You hungry?" She was, she realized, ravenous. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Yesterday morning, maybe. "Yes, please." What followed was the strangest meal of Maylene's life. The rancher, he still hadn't offered his name, and she hadn't asked, prepared food with the same efficient silence he'd shown tending her feet. Bacon, beans, thick slices of bread. He set a plate in front of her at the table, poured coffee, then took his own seat and ate without conversation. Maylene had been raised with strict rules about mealtime propriety, about not speaking with one's mouth full, about eating delicately and slowly. She abandoned all of it, shoveling food into her mouth with desperate hunger, burning her tongue on the coffee and not caring. When her plate was empty, he refilled it without comment. The second helping disappeared more slowly, and as the edge came off her hunger, awareness crept back in. She was in a stranger's home, a man's home, wearing his clothes, dependent on his mercy. And outside, the storm still raged. "How long will it last?" she asked, breaking the silence. He glanced toward the window. 3 days, maybe 4. It's a big one. 3 days. Terror and relief warred in her chest. 3 days of safety from Cain's men, who wouldn't travel in this weather. But 3 days trapped here, with a man she didn't know, in a cabin miles from anywhere. "I'm sorry," she said, because it seemed necessary. "For bringing trouble to your door." "You didn't bring trouble. You brought yourself, half frozen." He sipped his coffee. "Trouble's the men who drive a woman into a blizzard. Still, when the storm ends, I should leave." "To go where?" The question was simple, logical, and devastating. Maylene had no answer. She couldn't go back to the settlement, couldn't head south to any other town. Cain's reach extended for miles, and his reputation traveled farther. She had no money, no friends, no family in this country. Nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The reality of her situation crashed down on her, and for the first time since fleeing into the storm, Maylene felt tears burn behind her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She'd survived too much to cry now. But the rancher saw. His expression shifted, something almost like discomfort crossing his features. "You can stay," he said abruptly, "through the storm. After that, we'll figure something out. I have no money to pay you. Didn't ask for money." "Then what?" She stopped, drew a breath, and made a decision. If she was going to survive, she needed to be practical, needed to offer what she could. "I could work, cook, clean, mend clothes. I know how to do these things." He considered this, his gaze steady on her face. "That's fair." Relief flooded through her. A bargain then, labor for shelter. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. "Chen Maylin. In America, Maylin Chen." "Gideon Hale." He extended his hand across the table, an American gesture she'd learned. She took it, felt the calluses, the strength in his grip. A working man's hand, like her father's had been. "Thank you, Mr. Hale, for saving my life." "Gideon's fine." He released her hand. "And I didn't do it for thanks. You needed help. I helped. That's all. That's all." As if pulling a dying woman from a blizzard was simply a chore no more remarkable than mending a fence or feeding livestock. Maylene studied him across the table, this strange, taciturn man who'd taken her in without hesitation, who asked for nothing, who seemed to expect nothing. In her experience, men always wanted something, always had an angle, an agenda. But Gideon Hale just stood, collected the plates, and began washing them in a basin of heated water, his movements practiced and methodical. "You can sleep in the loft," he said over his shoulder. "There's extra blankets in the trunk. I'll stay down here. I don't want to take your bed. It's not a discussion. You're still half frozen and you need proper rest. I'll be fine by the stove." Something in his tone made it clear that arguing would be pointless. Maylene nodded, too exhausted to protest further. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her feet screaming with every step, and found a simple bed with a cornhusk mattress and heavy quilts. She burrowed under the blankets, her body finally beginning to truly warm, and listened to the sounds of Gideon moving around below. The clink of dishes, the creak of floorboards, the crackle of the fire. Safe sounds. Human sounds. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside, Maylene was warm and fed and alive. It wasn't until she was drifting toward sleep that the full weight of what had happened settled over her. She'd escaped Cain. She'd survived the storm. She'd found shelter with a stranger who seemed, impossibly, to be exactly what he appeared, a decent man. But she was still trapped, still dependent, still one wrong move away from disaster. And she still had no idea what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, Maylene woke to the smell of coffee and the continued roar of the blizzard. Her body ached in 1,000 places, muscles stiff from yesterday's ordeal, feet throbbing with renewed pain. But she was alive, and in the gray light filtering through the loft's small window, that seemed like a miracle. She descended the ladder carefully, wincing with each step. Gideon was already up, tending the stove. He glanced at her as she reached the bottom. How are the feet? They hurt. Good. Pain means the tissue's alive. He poured coffee, handed her a cup. Let me see them. It became a morning ritual over the next 3 days. Gideon would examine her feet, clean and rebandage them, his touch careful despite the rough appearance of his hands. Then breakfast, always simple, always filling. Afterward, Maylene would insist on helping with chores despite his protests. She discovered that keeping house for one person in a blizzard required less work than she'd expected, which left long hours of shared silence. Gideon wasn't a talker. He moved through the cabin like a ghost, performing tasks with minimal fuss, speaking only when necessary. But Maylene watched him, learning his patterns. The way he checked the windows every hour, assessing the storm. The care he took with his tools, cleaning and maintaining them even when not in use. The reverence with which he handled the Winchester rifle mounted above the door, checking its action, counting ammunition. A man who'd seen trouble before, who expected it might come again. On the second day, she found a photograph tucked on a high shelf while looking for sewing supplies. A woman and a small boy, their faces solemn in the way of old photographs. She replaced it quickly, said nothing, but she understood a little better why Gideon lived alone, why grief seemed to hang in the corners of the cabin like cobwebs. That evening, as they sat by the stove, her mending one of his shirts, him oiling a harness, he spoke without prompting. 5 years ago, fever took them both within a week. Maylene's hand stilled on the fabric. She didn't ask who, didn't need to. I'm sorry. Not your fault. He worked oil into the leather with steady strokes. Not anybody's fault, just happens sometimes. Yes. She thought of her husband, crushed in a mine cave-in, of her brother who'd died as an infant, of her grandmother who'd simply not woken one morning. It happens. They sat in silence after that, but it was different somehow. A silence of shared understanding rather than mere absence of words. On the third day, the wind began to ease. By the fourth morning, it had stopped entirely, leaving behind a world transformed. Through the window, Maylene could see nothing but white. Drifts piled high against the cabin walls, trees bent under the weight of snow, the entire landscape smooth and pristine, beautiful and deadly. Gideon spent the morning digging out, clearing the door, making a path to the barn where he kept his horses and cattle. Maylene helped as much as her still-healing feet would allow, shoveling snow away from the porch. When they came back inside for the midday meal, both breathing hard from exertion, Gideon paused at the door. Storm's over, he said unnecessarily. Yes. You'll need to make a choice. Maylene set down the shovel, turned to face him. What choice? You can't go back to the settlement. We both know that. But you can't stay here indefinitely either. He held her gaze. This isn't proper. A single woman living with a single man. People will talk. I don't care what people say. Maybe you should. His expression was serious. Cain is the kind of man who'll use any excuse to come after what he thinks is his. If word gets back to him that you're here, then he'll come. Fear flickered in her chest, but Maylene pushed it down. Let him come. I won't go back. You don't understand. Cain has men, guns, I understand perfectly. Maylene stepped closer, looked up at this weathered, careful man who'd saved her life. I understand that I have nothing left. No money, no family, no home. I understand that I'm Chinese in a country that hates Chinese. That I'm a woman in a world made for men. That I'm worth less than nothing to people like Cain, except as property to be used. She paused, gathered her courage, and spoke the words that had been forming in her mind since the first night. So I'll offer you the only thing I have left. A bargain. Let me stay. Let me work for you, keep your house, cook your food, and in return, she took a breath. I'll marry you. Gideon stared at her as if she'd just sprouted a second head. What? It solves the problem. A married woman living with her husband. No one can say anything. Cain can't claim a married woman. And you, she gestured around the cabin, you need someone here to help, to... No. The word was flat, final. Maylene felt something crumble inside her chest. No? I don't need a wife. Don't want one. He turned away, started removing his coat. You can stay through the winter. Help with chores, like we agreed. Come spring, I'll take you to Fort Collins. You can find work there, start over. And if Cain comes before spring, then we'll deal with it. How? You said yourself he has men, guns. I said we'll deal with it. Gideon hung his coat on a peg with more force than necessary. Discussion's over. But it wasn't. Not really. Because that night, lying in the loft, listening to Gideon's steady breathing from below, Maylene understood something crucial. He hadn't said yes to marriage, but he hadn't told her to leave either. And in a world where she had nothing, nowhere to go, no one to turn to, that sliver of maybe was everything. Outside, the stars glittered cold and bright over the snow. And somewhere to the south, in a settlement she'd never returned to, Barrett Cain was waiting for the weather to clear enough for him to come collect what he believed was his. The storm had ended, but the real fight was only beginning. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as steady and cold as the Wyoming winter itself. Maylene rose before dawn, her feet still tender but healing, and had coffee brewing by the time Gideon came in from tending the livestock. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, then set about the day's work. Him outside breaking ice in the water troughs and repairing storm damage, her inside mending clothes and preparing meals from the dried goods stored in the cellar. It was a strange sort of partnership, born of necessity and sustained by mutual respect. Gideon never mentioned her proposal again, and Maylene didn't raise it, but it hung between them nonetheless, an unspoken possibility that colored every interaction. She learned things about him in those quiet days, that he checked the southern horizon every time he came inside, his eyes scanning for movement, that he kept the Winchester cleaned and loaded, always within reach, that he slept light, waking at the smallest sound. A man prepared for trouble, even if he didn't speak of it. And she learned that beneath the gruff exterior and careful distance, Gideon Hale was fundamentally decent. He never touched her without asking, never raised his voice, never made her feel like the burden she knew she was. When her feet pained her too much to stand, he brought her a chair by the stove and told her to rest. When she tried to thank him, he just shrugged and went back to work. It made her proposal seem even more practical. They worked well together, neither expected romance or passion, just survival, companionship, shared labor. What more did a marriage need in a place like this? But Gideon had said no, and Maylene was learning that he was a man who meant what he said. 6 days after the storm ended, he came in from the barn with trouble written across his face. "Riders," he said, setting his rifle by the door. "2 of them, coming from the south." Maylene's stomach dropped. "Cain?" "Don't know yet, but nobody rides out in this weather without good reason." He moved to the window, peered through the frost-rimmed glass. "Stay inside, don't show yourself." She wanted to argue, to insist she wouldn't hide like a frightened animal, but the hard set of Gideon's jaw told her this wasn't the time. She moved away from the window, positioning herself where she could see but not be easily seen. The riders appeared 10 minutes later, 2 dark shapes against the white landscape. They moved slowly, carefully, their horses picking their way through the deep snow. As they drew closer, Maylene could make out details: heavy coats, hats pulled low, rifles in saddle holsters. One of them was Tom Carter, Cain's foreman. She'd seen him in the settlement, a lean man with cruel eyes and quick fists. The other she didn't recognize, but he had the same hard look about him. They stopped 30 feet from the cabin, and Carter called out, "Gideon Hale, we need to talk." Gideon opened the door but didn't step outside. "Talk then. You got a Chinese woman here, small, maybe this tall?" Carter held his hand at shoulder height. "Wearing a green dress? Why are you asking?" "She belongs to Barrett Cain, payment for her dead husband's debts. She ran off during the storm, and Mr. Cain wants her back." "Belongs to him." Gideon's voice was flat, dangerous. "That's an interesting way to put it, considering we fought a war about people belonging to other people." Carter's expression hardened. "That was about blacks, and you know it. This is different. She's Chinese, and her husband owed money. Law's on our side." "What law? Show me the paper that says a widow inherits her husband's debts." "Common law. Everyone knows. Common law isn't law at all. It's just men like Cain making up rules as they go." Gideon shifted his weight, and Maylene saw his hand move closer to the rifle leaning against the doorframe. And even if it was legal, which it isn't, I haven't seen any Chinese woman here. It was a lie, spoken so calmly that for a moment even Maylene almost believed it. Carter clearly didn't. That's so. Then you won't mind if we look around. I would mind. This is my property, and you're not welcome on it. Mr. Cain's going to want to hear about this. Then tell him. Tell him exactly what I said, that I don't give a damn what he wants. The second rider spoke for the first time, his voice rough and tobacco-stained. You're making a mistake, Hale. Cain doesn't forget. Neither do I. Gideon's hand closed on the Winchester. He didn't lift it, didn't point it, just held it. The message was clear enough. Now get off my land before you find out what I remember. For a long moment, nobody moved. Maylene held her breath, watching Carter's face, seeing the calculation there. 2 men against 1, but Gideon had cover and they didn't. The odds weren't as favorable as they seemed. Carter finally nodded, his smile cold. We'll be back. I'll be here. They turned their horses and rode away, slow and deliberate, refusing to show any hint of retreat. Gideon stood in the doorway until they disappeared over a rise, then closed the door and set the rifle back in its place. That's it then, Maylene said quietly. He knows I'm here. He suspects, doesn't know for certain. Gideon moved to the stove, poured coffee with steady hands. And suspecting isn't the same as proving. They'll come back with more men. Probably. Then I should leave before they... And go where? He turned to face her, his expression harder than she'd ever seen it. Into the snow? To another settlement where Cain's got friends. You think running worked out so well the first time that you should try it again? I don't want to bring this on you. You've done enough. I decide what's enough. He set his coffee down harder than necessary. You want to help? Stop talking about leaving and start thinking about how we defend this place if they do come back. The words hung in the air between them. We. Defend. As if they were a unit, a partnership, something more than just a man and a refugee he'd taken in from the storm. Why? Maylene asked, the question pulling itself from somewhere deep in her chest. Why are you doing this? You could tell me to leave. Tell them where I am. Get rid of the problem. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, his gray-blue eyes unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. 5 years ago, when the fever came, I rode 3 days to Fort Collins to fetch a doctor. Paid him double his normal rate to come back with me. He took my money, looked at my wife and son, and told me there was nothing he could do. Said he wouldn't waste his time on a lost cause. He paused. They died 2 days later. Maylene didn't know what to say. What comfort could she offer for a pain like that? I've thought about that a lot, Gideon continued. About what it means when people give up on other people, when they decide someone isn't worth the trouble or the risk, when they make their choices based on what's easy instead of what's right. He met her eyes. I won't be that man. Not then, not now, not ever. Understanding settled over Maylene like a weight. This wasn't about her specifically. This was about principle, about the kind of man Gideon had decided to be after. Loss had carved him hollow and left him alone in a cabin full of ghosts. Thank you, she said, because there was nothing else to say. He nodded, picked up his coffee, and the moment passed. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, Maylene lay awake in the loft, listening to the house settle and Gideon's breathing from below. Her mind churned with scenarios, possibilities, fears. Cain would come back. Of that she was certain. And when he did, it wouldn't be with just 2 men. She thought of Gideon standing in the doorway, rifle in hand, facing down Carter and his companion without a hint of fear. Thought of the quiet steel in his voice, the absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. A good man, a rare thing in her experience. And she was going to get him killed, unless she found a way to make herself less vulnerable, less of a target, less easy to claim as property. Her proposal still stood, whether Gideon acknowledged it or not. Marriage would change everything, legally, socially, practically. Cain might still come, but he'd be coming for another man's wife, which was a different matter entirely in the eyes of the law and the community. But Gideon had said no, and she had no leverage, no way to convince him beyond the practical arguments she'd already made. Unless The thought that came to her then was calculated and cold, born of desperation and pragmatism. She pushed it away at first, uncomfortable with her own ruthlessness, but it came back, persistent, refusing to be ignored. Gideon was a man of principle. He'd made that clear. He'd protect her because it was right, regardless of cost to himself. But he'd also said he didn't want a wife, didn't need one. What if she could make him need one? Not through seduction. The thought made her uncomfortable. And besides, she doubted it would work on a man as controlled as Gideon, but through proving herself indispensable, through becoming not a burden he protected out of principle, but a partner he relied on out of necessity. She'd been doing it already without realizing it. The mended clothes, the hot meals, the clean house. Small things easily dismissed. But what if she did more? Became not just helpful, but essential. It was manipulative, she knew. But survival often was. The next morning, Maylene began her campaign in earnest. She started with the obvious, taking over all the indoor work completely, freeing Gideon to focus on the harder outdoor labor. But she went further, learning the rhythms of the ranch, anticipating needs before they arose. When Gideon came in from the barn, his gloves were already drying by the stove. When the water barrel ran low, she'd filled it from the pump before he noticed. When he mentioned needing to inventory the cellar, she'd already done it and made a list of supplies to purchase in spring. Small things. Necessary things. Things a partner would do. And she watched him, learning what he needed but didn't ask for. She noticed that his right shoulder bothered him in cold weather, legacy of some old injury, and began heating stones to wrap in cloth for him to lean against. She saw that he rationed the coffee, making each pound last, and quietly stretched it further by mixing in chicory root the way her mother had taught her. She made herself useful, made herself needed, made herself part of the functioning of this small household until the thought of her leaving would create a gap he'd actually feel. Gideon noticed. How could he not? But he said nothing, just accepted the small improvements to his life with the same quiet grace he accepted everything else. 3 days after Carter's visit, a snowstorm rolled in, smaller than the first, but still significant. They spent the day inside, Gideon repairing tack while Maylin worked on a shirt she was making from fabric she'd found in the trunk. His shirt, sized for his frame, because his others were wearing through at the elbows. "You don't have to do that," he said, watching her careful stitches. "I want to. You've given me so much. Let me give something back. Room and board in exchange for work. That's the arrangement. Then consider this part of the work." She didn't look up from her sewing. "A man needs good clothes, especially out here." He grunted something that might have been agreement and went back to his leather work. But Maylene caught the slight softening in his expression, the way his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. That evening, after a supper of venison stew and cornbread, they sat by the stove as had become their habit. Gideon was cleaning the Winchester, a weekly ritual, while Maylene finished the shirt. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. He looked up. "Who?" "Your wife and son. You don't have to, but I'd like to know." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. He returned his attention to the rifle, working oil into the action with careful strokes. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. "Sarah was a school teacher, came out from Pennsylvania to teach in Fort Collins. I met her at a church social." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She thought I was the rudest man she'd ever met because I barely said 2 words to her. Didn't realize I was just too nervous to talk." Maylene smiled despite herself. "How did you win her over?" "Persistence. And I fixed the schoolhouse roof when nobody else would. She appreciated practical gestures." He paused. "We married in the spring of '66. Built this place together, her and me. She wanted to be away from town. Said she liked the quiet, the space." "And your son?" "James. Born in '68. Looked just like his mother. Blonde hair, blue eyes, stubborn as hell." The smile returned, sad and distant. "He was only 4 when the fever came." "I'm sorry." "So am I." He set down the rifle, stared into the stove's glow. "I tell myself it gets easier with time. Some days I almost believe it." Maylene set down her sewing, the shirt finished. She understood grief, had carried enough of her own across an ocean. "My brother died when he was 6 months old. My mother, she never stopped mourning him. Even years later, she'd set out an extra bowl at meals sometimes, forgetting. You miss them, your family. Every day. She folded the shirt carefully. But I can't go back. Even if I had the money for passage, there's nothing for me there. My parents arranged my marriage to give me a future. Going back would shame them. So we're both stuck in places we never planned to be. Maybe. She looked at him across the space between their chairs. Or maybe we're exactly where we need to be. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or recognition of what she was really saying. But he didn't respond, just picked up the rifle again and continued his work. The next day brought visitors of a different sort. Maylene heard them first, a jingle of harness bells, the creak of wagon wheels. She called to Gideon, who was splitting wood behind the cabin, and he came around front, axe still in hand. The wagon that rolled into the yard belonged to the Johnsons, neighbors from the next valley over, a family of Swedish immigrants who ran a small farm. Eric Johnson sat on the bench beside his wife Ingrid, their 3 children bundled in the back among sacks of grain. "Hail!" Eric called, his accent thick but his smile genuine. "We saw your smoke, thought we'd stop." Gideon set down the axe and moved to greet them, his expression wary but not unwelcoming. Maylene hung back, uncertain of her place in this interaction. Ingrid spotted her immediately, her sharp eyes taking in everything, the oversized men's clothes, the way Maylene stood in the doorway of Gideon's cabin, the domestic scene they'd stumbled upon. "Gideon," she said carefully, climbing down from the wagon. "You have company?" "This is Maylene Chen. She's helping with the housework through the winter." It was a careful explanation, technically true, and Ingrid heard everything it didn't say. Her gaze sharpened, but her voice remained friendly. "How nice! I'm sure you appreciate the help, yeah?" She turned to Maylene. "I am Ingrid. These are my children, Lars, Britta, and little Eric." Maylene bowed slightly, a gesture from her homeland that felt appropriate. "I'm pleased to meet you." "Come inside," Gideon said, though he didn't sound particularly enthusiastic. "Coffee's hot." What followed was the most awkward hour Maylene had spent since arriving at the ranch. The Johnsons crowded into the cabin, the children wide-eyed and curious, the adults making polite conversation while clearly burning with questions they were too polite to ask directly. Eric discussed weather and livestock prices with Gideon. Ingrid admired the tidiness of the cabin, her eyes lingering on the mended curtains and the fresh bread cooling on the counter. The children whispered to each other in Swedish until their mother hushed them. And through it all, Maylene felt the weight of judgment, not harsh, but present. A Chinese woman living alone with a white man wearing his clothes, keeping his house. The implications were clear to everyone in the room. "We heard there was trouble in the settlement," Eric said eventually, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "Something about Barrett Cain looking for a runaway." Gideon's expression didn't change. "That's so." "Ja, he's been asking around the valley, seeing if anyone's seen a Chinese woman, offering a reward." Eric paused. "Seems she owes him money." "Or her dead husband did," Ingrid added quietly, "depending on who you ask." Silence filled the cabin. Maylene kept her eyes down, focusing on her coffee cup, feeling the attention of everyone present shift toward her. "Well," Gideon said finally, his voice level, "I haven't seen anyone matching that description." It was the same lie he'd told Carter, delivered with the same calm certainty. Eric and Ingrid exchanged a glance, and Maylene saw understanding pass between them. They knew. Of course they knew. But they were choosing not to push, not to demand confirmation. "That's good," Eric said slowly, "because Cain's not a good man. Anyone who helped someone he was looking for, that would be dangerous. I appreciate the concern. We just want you to be careful, Gideon." Ingrid's voice was gentle but firm. "You've been alone a long time. We worry about you, and if you've taken in someone who needs help." She looked at Maylene directly. "We understand kindness, but kindness can have consequences. I can handle the consequences. Can you?" Eric leaned forward. "Cain has 8, maybe 10 men who'll do whatever he says. You're one man, alone on a remote ranch. If he decides to come for whatever he's looking for, how will you stop him?" The question hung heavy in the air. Maylene watched Gideon's face, saw the muscle tick in his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes. He knew Eric was right. They all knew it. "I'll manage," he said finally. Ingrid sighed, a sound full of frustration and affection. You're a stubborn man, Gideon Hale. Always have been. She stood, brushing off her skirts. But you're also a good man. So I'll tell you this. If you need help, you send word. Eric and the boys will come. We don't like bullies either. Gideon looked surprised. Ingrid, don't argue. Sarah was my friend. You think I'll let Cain's thugs hurt her widower? She collected her children with efficient maternal authority. Come, we should go before the weather turns. The Johnsons departed in a flurry of farewells and bundled children, leaving Maylene and Gideon standing in the yard, watching their wagon disappear into the white landscape. They know, Maylene said quietly. Yes. Will they tell Cain? No. Gideon turned back to the cabin. The Johnsons are good people. They'll keep quiet, but others might not be so kind. Then word will spread. Probably already has. Valley's small. People talk. Maylene followed him inside, her mind racing. The Johnsons' visit had changed things, made her presence here official in a way it hadn't been before. She wasn't just a refugee anymore. She was a known entity, a point of gossip, a situation that demanded explanation. And Gideon was harboring her, lying about it, making himself an accomplice to her flight from Cain. I could leave tonight, she said, before— No. He didn't look at her, just moved to the stove and poured coffee he didn't drink. We've been through this. But the Johnsons are right. If Cain comes— When Cain comes, Gideon corrected, we'll be ready. How? You said yourself he has 10 men. We're just 2 people. 2 people can hold a fortified position against larger numbers. The cabin's solid, built to withstand trouble. We've got food, water, ammunition. If they try to storm us, we make them pay for every inch. He was talking about a siege, about violence, about risking his life for her, and he said it as calmly as discussing the weather. This is insane, Maylene whispered. Maybe. He finally met her eyes. But I've made my choice. Now you need to make yours. You want to run and take your chances out there, or you want to stand and fight here? Stand and fight. The words resonated in her chest, awakening something she'd thought Cain had beaten out of her. Not helplessness, not passive acceptance, but the fierce determination to choose her own fate, even if it meant choosing to fight. I'll stand, she said. Gideon nodded once, satisfied. Then we prepare. Starting tomorrow, you learn to shoot. The next morning, in the clear, cold air behind the cabin, Gideon put the Winchester in her hands for the first time. The rifle was heavier than she'd expected, the metal cold even through her gloves. Gun's a tool, he said, positioning himself behind her, adjusting her grip. Respect it, but don't fear it. Fear makes you hesitate, and hesitation gets you killed. He spent the next hour teaching her the basics: how to load, how to aim, how to breathe and squeeze rather than pull the trigger. She fired at a target he'd nailed to a tree, missing wildly at first, then gradually finding her accuracy. The recoil bruised her shoulder. The noise hurt her ears. But with each shot, she felt less like a victim and more like someone who could protect herself. You're a natural, Gideon said, and she heard approval in his voice. They practiced every day after that, until loading and firing became reflexive. Until Maylene could hit a tin can at 50 yards more often than not. Until the weight of the rifle in her hands felt less like burden and more like power. And through it all, the specter of Cain's return hung over them like a gathering storm, inevitable and approaching, waiting only for the right moment to break. That moment came on a gray afternoon 2 weeks after the Johnsons' visit, when 6 riders appeared on the southern horizon, moving purposefully through the snow toward Gideon's ranch. Cain had come to collect his property, and he'd brought an army to do it. Gideon saw them first. He'd been checking the fence line near the southern pasture when movement caught his eye. Dark shapes against white snow, too deliberate to be wildlife. 6 riders, moving in formation like soldiers who'd learned discipline the hard way. Inside, he said, already moving toward the cabin. Now. Maylene didn't argue. They'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in their minds, if not in practice. She ran ahead of him, reaching the cabin first and immediately beginning the sequence they'd discussed. Bar the back door, close and latch the shutters on the windows. Pull the extra ammunition down from the high shelf. Gideon followed seconds later, the Winchester already in his hands, his face carved from stone. He moved to the front window, peering through the narrow gap between shutter slats. 6 men, he confirmed. Cain's in front. I recognize Carter and 2 others from the settlement. The rest, he shook his head. Hired guns, probably. They've got that look. Maylene's hand shook as she loaded the revolver he'd taught her to use. A Colt that had belonged to his father. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar now, after days of practice. She positioned herself at the side window as they'd planned, where she could cover the approach from the east. You remember what I told you? Gideon asked, his voice steady. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Don't waste ammunition. Don't let them see fear. She met his eyes. And don't let them take me alive. That last instruction had been the hardest to give, the hardest to accept, but they both knew what Cain would do if he got his hands on her. Death was preferable to that particular fate. Gideon's jaw tightened. It won't come to that. But if it does, it won't. The rider stopped 50 yards from the cabin, spreading out in a loose semicircle that covered all approach angles. Smart tactics. These weren't drunk cowhands looking for trouble. They were professionals executing a plan. Barrett Cain sat his horse in the center, a big man in his 50s with silver threading his dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if cruelty hadn't reshaped it over the years. He wore an expensive coat and fine gloves, the costume of a successful businessman. Only his eyes betrayed what he really was, a predator who'd learned to dress like prey. Gideon Hale! His voice carried easily across the snow. I believe we need to have a conversation. Gideon opened the door but stayed behind it, using the thick wood as cover. Say what you came to say, Cain. I'm looking for something that belongs to me. A Chinese woman, small, pretty in that exotic way. Her name's Maylin Chen, though I doubt she told you that. Cain's smile was visible even at this distance. I think you know where she is. I told your men already. Haven't seen anyone matching that description. That's funny, because the Johnsons mentioned they saw a Chinese woman here just 2 weeks ago, wearing men's clothes, keeping house, acting mighty comfortable in your cabin. Cain's voice hardened. So let's stop playing games. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No trouble, no violence, just business. She's not property, Cain. You can't own a person. Her dead husband owed me money, $2,300 to be exact. She's the collateral on that debt. Law's on my side. What law? Gideon's voice cut like a blade. Show me the statute that says a widow inherits debt. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show me one piece of the contract she signed. Show the contract she signed. Show me one piece of legitimate legal documentation and I'll consider your claim. Cain's smile disappeared. I don't need to show you anything. This is how things work out here, Hale. A man borrows money, he pays it back. If he can't, his property covers the debt. That's frontier justice. That's not justice at all, that's just theft dressed up in fancy words. You want to talk about theft? You're harboring my property. That makes you a thief. Cain leaned forward in his saddle. Last chance, Hale. Send the girl out, or this gets ugly. Maylin watched from her window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see Carter and the others, see how they'd positioned themselves for a fight. This wasn't a negotiation, it was theater, a show Cain was performing to justify what came next. She stays here, Gideon said flatly. You want her, you'll have to go through me. If that's how you want it, Cain raised his hand, signaling his men. We tried to do this the civilized way, remember that. He dropped his hand, and hell broke loose. The first shot came from Carter, aimed at the cabin's front wall just to the left of the door. Wood splintered, the bullet punching through the exterior boards but stopping against the interior logs. Gideon had built this place to last, and the double-wall construction proved its worth. Gideon returned fire immediately, his shot forcing Carter to dive from his saddle. The other men scattered, dismounting and taking cover behind anything they could find. The water trough, the woodpile, the skeletal remains of the wagon Gideon had been meaning to repair. They're trying to pin us down, Gideon called to Maylin. Watch your side. They'll try to flank. She kept her eyes on the eastern approach, the revolver heavy in her hands. Her training had been thorough, but nothing could prepare you for the reality of men trying to kill you. The fear was a living thing in her chest, clawing at her resolve. Movement caught her eye. One of the hired guns creeping low through the snow, trying to reach the side of the cabin. She aimed, hand steadier than she'd expected, and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up snow 2 feet to the man's left, but it was enough to make him freeze and reconsider his approach. Good, Gideon said. You don't have to hit them. Just make them think twice. The siege settled into a rhythm of sporadic gunfire and tense silence. Cain's men would advance, test the defenses, and retreat when met with accurate fire from the cabin. Gideon was a better shot than any of them, and he made them pay for their carelessness. One man took a bullet through the shoulder trying to rush the porch. Another lost his hat and nearly his head when he exposed himself trying to get a better angle. But the math was simple and brutal. 6 men outside with plenty of ammunition versus 2 people inside with limited supplies. Time favored the attackers. An hour into the standoff, Cain tried a different approach. Hale, this is pointless. You can't win. Gideon didn't respond, just waited with the patience of a man who'd learned to hunt dangerous animals. I've got men riding to the settlement right now, Cain continued. They'll bring back the marshal and a dozen more guns. By tomorrow, you'll be facing an army. Then I guess we'll see how many of you are willing to die for your boss's greed, Gideon shouted back. A different voice called out then, Tom Carter, from somewhere behind the water trough. It don't have to be like this, Hale. The woman ain't worth dying for. She's just some Chinese nobody who can't even speak proper English. Maylin felt the words like a slap. Just some Chinese nobody. As if her life, her suffering, her desperate flight for freedom meant nothing because of where she'd been born. She's worth more than all of you put together, Gideon's voice rang with unexpected fury. At least she's got the courage to fight for her freedom instead of selling it for Cain's money. The response was a volley of gunfire that tore into the cabin's walls. Maylin ducked as splinters flew, her ears ringing from the percussion. When the shooting stopped, she looked across at Gideon and saw blood running down his arm. You're hit! Just a graze. He pressed his hand against the wound, his face tight with pain. Bullet caught me through the window gap. I'm fine. He wasn't fine. The blood was flowing freely, staining his shirt. Maylin moved toward him, but he waved her back. Stay at your post. They'll try to use this. He was right. Within minutes, another rush came from the east side. 2 men moving fast, thinking the defenders were distracted. Maylene fired twice, her shots wild but effective enough to drive them back. "I need to bind that wound," she insisted. "Later. Right now we need to—" The crash of breaking glass cut him off. Something had come through the western window, a bottle wrapped in burning cloth, spilling kerosene and fire across the floor. Time seemed to slow. Maylene saw the flames catch on the dry wood, saw how quickly they spread, feeding on the fuel. Gideon was already moving, grabbing the blanket from his chair and using it to smother the fire. But more bottles came through other windows. Cain's men had coordinated their attack, and suddenly the cabin was filling with smoke and flame. "The water barrel!" Gideon shouted, beating at the flames. "We need to—" Another bottle crashed through, this one landing near the loft ladder. The fire raced up the dry wood like it had been waiting for this moment. Within seconds, the ladder was engulfed, cutting off access to the upper level. Maylene grabbed the water bucket, threw it on the nearest flames. It helped, but not enough. There was too much fire, spreading too fast, and only two of them to fight it. "We can't stay here," she cried, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. "The back door!" Gideon was still fighting the flames, his face black-lit by firelight. "We'll have to make a run for—" The explosion of breaking wood from the rear of the cabin told them that escape route was blocked. Cain's men had moved into position, waiting for exactly this moment. They were trapped between fire and guns, with no way out. Maylene looked at Gideon through the smoke and flames and saw her own desperation reflected in his eyes. This was it, the end they'd both known was coming but had refused to accept. They could burn or they could surrender, and either way, Cain won. Then Gideon's expression changed. His eyes focused on something behind her, and she turned to see what he was looking at. The iron poker that hung by the stove. Heavy, solid, 3 feet of forged metal with a sharp point designed for breaking up logs. Not a gun, but a weapon nonetheless. "When I open the front door," Gideon said, his voice cutting through the roar of flames, "I'm going to lay down covering fire. You go out fast and low heading for Carter's position. He's the closest, and he's the one coordinating this attack." "What? No, I can't." "Yes, you can." He grabbed her shoulders, his eyes fierce. "You're stronger than you know, Maylene. Braver than you think. I've watched you face down death and keep walking. This is just one more step. But the fire will kill us both if we stay here. At least this way we die fighting." He pressed the revolver into her hands. 3 shots left. Make them count. And if you get a chance at Cain, take it. She wanted to argue, to refuse, to find some other way. But the heat was growing unbearable, the smoke choking, and she could hear Cain's men outside laughing as they watched the cabin burn. They thought they'd won, thought they'd broken the spirit of the people inside. They were wrong. "Give me the poker," she said. Gideon's eyebrows rose. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She set down the revolver and grabbed the iron tool, feeling its weight, its balance. She thought of every insult, every dismissal, every time someone had looked at her and seen only property, only a thing to be used. "I'm done running, done hiding, done being treated like I don't matter." Something fierce and proud flashed across Gideon's face. "That's my girl." The words sent unexpected warmth through her chest, cutting through the fear. Not his property, not his burden, his partner, his equal, someone worth fighting beside. "On 3, Gideon said, moving to the door, Winchester ready. 1, 2, 3. He kicked open the door and stepped onto the porch, his rifle spitting fire and thunder. Maylene burst out behind him, running low like he'd taught her, the poker gripped in both hands. She heard shouting, saw muzzle flashes in the darkness, felt bullets cutting the air near her head. Carter was exactly where Gideon had said, crouched behind the water trough, reloading his rifle. He saw her coming, and his eyes went wide with surprise. A Chinese woman in oversized men's clothes, running straight at him through gunfire with a fireplace poker raised like a sword. He fumbled for his pistol, but Maylene was faster. She swung the poker with every ounce of strength in her body, catching him across the shoulder. He went down hard, his gun flying from his grip. She reversed her swing and brought the poker down again, this time connecting with his rifle, shattering the stock and rendering it useless. Behind her, Gideon's Winchester cracked methodically, each shot deliberate and deadly. She heard a scream, heard someone yell, "Man down!" Heard the sudden uncertainty in the attackers' voices. Then she saw the man with the lantern. He was younger than the others, barely 20, and he was trying to light another bottle of kerosene. The lantern in his left hand, the bottle in his right, and he was so focused on his task that he didn't see Maylene charging toward him until she was 5 feet away. His head snapped up, his mouth opened to shout a warning, and Maylene drove the poker straight into the lantern. Glass shattered, kerosene sprayed, and the burning wick ignited it all. The man dropped everything and stumbled backward, batting at the flames spreading across his coat. The bottle he'd been preparing fell to the snow and broke, the kerosene pooling harmlessly away from the cabin. "Fall back!" Cain's voice, no longer confident but sharp with anger. "Fall back and regroup." The attackers retreated into the darkness, dragging their wounded, their coordinated assault broken by 2 desperate people who'd refused to burn quietly. Maylene stood in the snow, the poker still gripped in her hands, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Behind her, the cabin blazed, the flames now consuming everything they owned. But they were alive. They'd survived. Gideon appeared at her side, his face blackened with smoke, his wounded arm hanging at an awkward angle. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes? You? Been better?" He looked at the burning cabin, his expression grim. "We can't stay here." "The barn?" "Too obvious. They'll surround it, burn it too." He scanned the darkness, thinking. "The root cellar. It's stone, fireproof, and they might not know about it. We can hold out there until morning." They ran, leaving the cabin to its funeral pyre, ducking low to avoid any shots from the regrouping attackers. The root cellar was 50 yards from the house, built into a small rise and covered with earth and stone. Gideon pulled open the heavy door, and they scrambled inside, pulling it shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole. The cellar was small, barely 8 feet square, lined with shelves of preserved food and sacks of winter vegetables. Cold as a grave, but dry and safe. Maylene heard Gideon moving in the darkness, heard him grunt with pain as he settled against the wall. She fumbled in the dark until her hands found him. "Let me see your arm." "Can't see anything down here." "Then let me feel it." She ran her fingers carefully over his shoulder, found where the bullet had carved a furrow through muscle. Deep but clean, the bleeding already slowing. She tore a strip from her shirt, his shirt really, the one she'd been wearing, and bound the wound as best she could in the darkness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You saved my life. Again." "You saved both our lives. That move with the poker." She heard the smile in his voice. "Carter's going to feel that for a month, assuming he lives." They sat in silence then, listening to the muffled sounds from outside. Shouting. The crackle of the burning cabin, the nervous whinny of horses. Cain's men were still out there, still dangerous, but the fight had gone out of them for now. "What happens in the morning?" Maylene asked. "Cain will regroup. Bring more men like he threatened, or he'll give up and leave if he decides we're more trouble than we're worth." "Which do you think he'll do?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "Cain's not the kind of man who forgives being defied. He'll come back, with more men and more guns. And next time, he'll be ready for us to fight. Then we need to leave. Tonight, while it's still dark." "And go where?" "We've got no supplies, no horses, no food. Winter's not over. We'd die in the wilderness before we made it anywhere safe." He was right, and they both knew it. They'd won this battle, but lost the war. Cain would return, and when he did, they'd have nothing left to fight with. Maylene felt despair creeping in, cold and suffocating as the darkness around them. They'd fought so hard, survived so much, and it had all been for nothing. Cain would win. He always won. Men like him always did. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have left when you first told me to, before the Johnsons came, before all this. You'd still have your home, your life." "Stop." Gideon's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip firm and warm. "I made my choices. Don't regret them for me. But your cabin is just wood and nails. I can build another cabin. I can't rebuild my conscience if I'd let Cain take you." His words hung in the cold air between them, heavy with meaning. In the darkness, without faces to read or eyes to search, truth came easier. "Why?" Maylene asked. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me? We're strangers. We've known each other barely a month. You owe me nothing." "Maybe that's exactly why." Gideon's thumb moved across her knuckles, a gesture so small and gentle it made her chest ache. "Because I don't owe you anything. which means everything I do is a choice. And I choose to believe that one person standing up for another matters, that protecting someone who can't protect themselves is worth whatever it costs. Even your life? Especially my life. What good is living if you compromise everything you believe in just to keep breathing? He paused. Sarah used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Maylene felt tears burning behind her eyes. She sounds like she was wise. She was. Brave too. When the fever came, she made me promise I wouldn't let it make me bitter. Wouldn't let losing them turn me into someone who'd stopped caring about people. His voice roughened. Some days that's harder than others. But you kept your promise. Tried to. Still trying. They sat in silence, hands clasped in the darkness, two survivors holding on to each other in a world that seemed determined to crush them both. Outside, the sounds of Cain's men faded as they pulled back to make camp, waiting for daylight to finish what they'd started. Gideon? Maylene said finally. Yeah? If we survive this, if somehow we make it through tomorrow, my proposal still stands. She felt him go still beside her. Maylene, I know you said no. I know you don't want a wife, don't need one, but I'm not offering myself as a burden or an obligation anymore. She took a breath, gathering courage. I'm offering partnership. Two people who fought side by side, who trust each other, who choose to face the world together instead of alone. That's what marriage should be, Gideon said quietly. Not a transaction, not convenience, partnership. Then say yes. I can't promise you romance, can't promise I'll be easy to live with. I'm set in my ways, stubborn, not much of a talker. I don't need romance. I need someone who sees me as a person, not property. Someone who'll stand with me when the world turns cruel. Someone brave enough to face down 6 armed men because it's the right thing to do. She squeezed his hand. Someone exactly like you. The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer, thought she'd pushed too hard, asked for too much. Then she felt his other hand come up to cup her face in the darkness, rough calluses gentle against her cheek. If we survive tomorrow, he said, his voice low and solemn, I'll marry you. Not because I need a housekeeper, or because it's practical, or because it solves problems. I'll marry you because in 1 month you've reminded me that there's more to life than just surviving. That fighting for something, for someone, makes breathing worthwhile. Maylene felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since the day she'd stepped off the ship in San Francisco and realized all her husband's promises were lies. Hope. Real, fragile, terrifying hope. Then we survive, she said, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, he agreed. They settled against the cold stone wall, still holding hands, and waited for the dawn that would bring either death or deliverance. Above them, the cabin burned down to ash and embers. Outside, Cain's men made camp and plotted their next attack. But in the darkness of the root cellar, two people who'd both lost everything found something worth fighting for. Each other. Dawn came slowly to the root cellar, first as a thin gray line beneath the door, then as a gradual lightening that turned absolute darkness into murky shadow. Maylene had dozed fitfully through the night, waking every time Gideon shifted beside her, or whenever sounds from above filtered down through the earth. Footsteps, voices, the crack of wood being broken for a fire. Cain's men were still there, still waiting. Gideon had stayed awake the entire night, she realized, his breathing never settling into the rhythm of sleep. When enough light seeped in for her to see his face, she found him watching the door with the focused intensity of a predator waiting for prey to make a mistake. "How's your arm?" she whispered. "Stiff? Hurts like hell, but it works." He flexed his fingers to demonstrate, though she saw the wince he tried to hide. "We need to make a decision soon. They'll start searching systematically once the sun's fully up. What are our options? We can wait here and hope they don't find us. We can try to slip away while they're distracted. Or," he paused, his jaw tightening, "we can go out fighting, take as many of them with us as we can." None of those options sounded like survival. They sounded like choosing how to die. "There has to be another way," Maylene said. "Something we're not seeing. I'm open to suggestions." She thought hard, turning their situation over in her mind like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. 6 men above, maybe more if Cain had sent for reinforcements. 2 people below, 1 wounded, both exhausted, armed with whatever weapons they'd managed to salvage. No shelter, no supplies, nowhere to run, unless they changed the equation entirely. "What if we don't run from them?" she said slowly. "What if we make them run from us?" Gideon looked at her sharply. "Explain. They think they've won. They burned your cabin, drove us into hiding, probably assume we're either dead or will be soon. They're confident, maybe careless." She leaned forward, her mind racing. "What if we use that against them? Hit them when they're not expecting it. Make them think we're more dangerous than we are." 2 against 6 isn't odds that favor offense. "But they don't know we're only 2. For all Cain knows, you could have friends coming. The Johnsons could have spread word, brought help." She grabbed his good arm. "We make them believe they're the ones who should be afraid, that staying here is more dangerous than leaving." Gideon studied her face in the dim light, and she saw the exact moment when understanding clicked into place. A slow smile spread across his weathered features, fierce and dangerous. "You want to bluff them. I want to make them question whether this is worth dying for. Cain's men aren't soldiers. They're hired guns who work for money. How much is he paying them? Enough to risk their lives when they could be anywhere else? Carter's loyal, so are maybe 2 others, but the rest..." Gideon nodded slowly. "Yeah, the rest are just collecting wages. If this turns into a real war, they'll run. So we make it feel like a war." They spent the next hour planning in whispers, refining the details, accounting for everything that could go wrong. It was a desperate gamble built on psychology and misdirection, the kind of plan that would either work brilliantly or get them both killed in the first 5 minutes. Maylene found she didn't care about the odds anymore. Better to die fighting on her own terms than to wait in the dark for Cain's men to drag her into a life worse than death. When the sun had risen high enough that shadows shortened and visibility improved, they put their plan into motion. Gideon eased open the cellar door just enough to peer out. The burned remnants of the cabin smoldered 50 yards away, black timbers jutting from ash like broken bones. Cain's men had made camp near the barn, 6 dark shapes around a fire, drinking coffee and passing a bottle of whiskey despite the early hour. "They're relaxed," Gideon murmured. "Good. Carter's with them, but I don't see Cain." "Maybe he went back to the settlement," Maylin suggested. "Or maybe he's in the barn, staying warm while his men do the dirty work." Gideon counted again, checking positions. "The one on the left is the boy you went after with the poker. See how he's favoring his shoulder? You did real damage there." Maylene felt a fierce satisfaction at that. The boy had been trying to burn them alive. He deserved worse than a bruised shoulder. "Ready?" Gideon asked. "Ready." He pushed the door open wider and called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow. "Cain, I want to talk." The men at the fire jerked upright, scrambling for weapons. Carter grabbed his rifle and took cover behind a water barrel they'd dragged from the ruins. The others spread out, suddenly alert and dangerous again. But no one fired. They were waiting for orders. "Where's your boss?" Gideon shouted. "Or did he run back to town already?" A moment later, Barrett Cain emerged from the barn, looking worse for wear. His expensive coat was stained with soot and blood. Not his own, Maylene guessed, but belonging to one of his wounded men. His face was haggard with anger and lack of sleep. "Hale, I figured the fire got you." "Takes more than fire to kill me." Gideon stepped fully out of the cellar, the Winchester cradled in his arms. "But I'm willing to make you a deal." "I don't make deals with thieves." "Then you're going to die here." Gideon's voice cracked like a whip. "Because I sent a rider to the Johnson ranch last night. By noon there'll be 20 men here, and they won't be as patient as I've been." It was a complete lie, delivered with such conviction that even Maylene almost believed it. She watched Cain's face carefully, saw doubt flicker across his features. "You're bluffing," Cain called, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Am I? You know the Johnsons. You know Eric fought in the war, trained dozens of men in tactics and shooting. You really think he'd let you burn out his neighbor without consequences?" Gideon let that sink in. "You've got maybe an hour before they arrive. So here's my offer. You leave now, you and your men ride out, and we forget this ever happened. You stay, and we end this with blood." Carter stood from behind the barrel. He's lying, Mr. Cain. There's no riders coming. You sure about that, Carter? Gideon swung the Winchester toward him, and the foreman ducked reflexively. You sure enough to bet your life on it? Maylene chose that moment to emerge from the cellar, and she saw the shock register on every face. The Chinese woman was supposed to be cowering, helpless, maybe dead. Instead, she stood beside Gideon with a revolver in her hand and fire in her eyes, looking like someone who'd kill without hesitation. She aimed at the boy with the injured shoulder and saw him flinch. I don't run anymore, she said, her voice carrying despite her accent. You come for me, I come for you. All of you. One of the hired guns, a grizzled man in his 40s with a scar across his cheek, turned to Cain. Boss, maybe we should think about this. If there's really more men coming, there's no men coming, Cain snapped. It's a bluff. You willing to bet on that? The scarred man gestured toward his companions. Because I signed on to collect a debt, not fight a war. You didn't say nothing about taking on an army. There's no army. Just two people trying to scare you. Two people who killed Morrison and crippled Davis, another man pointed out. Morrison, that must have been the name of the one Gideon had shot during the attack. Two people who fought off 6 of us and burned our damn plan to ash. Malin saw the dynamic shifting, saw the hired guns exchanging glances, recalculating their odds and their commitment. These were mercenaries, not fanatics. They didn't care about Cain's wounded pride or his debt collection. They cared about staying alive. I'll double your pay, Cain said desperately. Every man here, double wages if you see this through. Double wages don't spend if you're dead, the scarred man said flatly. He lowered his rifle. I'm out, Cain. Find someone else to die for your money. He started walking toward his horse, and the floodgates opened. 2 more men followed immediately, then the boy with the injured shoulder, leaving only Carter and one other loyalist beside Cain. You cowards! Cain screamed. I'll make sure none of you work in this territory again. Better unemployed than buried, the scarred man called back. He and the others mounted up and rode out without looking back, their departure swift and final. Cain stood there, his face purple with rage, flanked by Carter and the remaining gunmen. 3 against 2 now, and even those odds were questionable given that one of Cain's men looked ready to bolt at the first sign of real danger. This isn't over, Cain said, his voice shaking. You think you've won, but all you've done is delay the inevitable. I'll go to the marshal, bring back the law. The law that you own? Gideon interrupted. The marshal who lives in your pocket? Good luck with that. Because when he gets here, he'll find a man who attacked a peaceful ranch, burned down a home, and tried to kidnap a woman against her will. That's arson and attempted abduction, Cain. Federal crimes. She owes me money. Her dead husband owed you money. She's not liable for his debts, and you know it. Gideon stepped forward, his rifle rising slightly. You came here with an illegal claim backed by illegal violence. The only crime being committed today is yours. Cain's hand moved toward his pistol, and everything happened at once. Carter raised his rifle, taking aim at Gideon. Maylene swung her revolver toward Carter and fired, the shot going wide but close enough to make him dive for cover. Gideon's Winchester cracked, the bullet punching into the ground at Cain's feet, kicking up snow and frozen earth. Next one goes through your heart, Gideon said calmly. Drop the gun, Cain. The third gunman had already dropped his weapon and raised his hands, clearly done with this entire situation. Carter stayed behind cover, his rifle pointed in Gideon's direction but his finger off the trigger. A standoff, fragile and deadly. Cain's face twisted with hate, but slowly, so slowly, he removed his hand from his pistol and raised both hands. This isn't over, he repeated, the words venomous. You've made an enemy today, Hale, a powerful enemy. I'll ruin you. I'll destroy everything you have left. I'll make you wish you'd died in that cabin. You already destroyed everything I have, Gideon said. My cabin's ash. My possessions are gone. All you left me with is my life and my principles. And I'll keep both, no matter what you try. He gestured with the rifle. Now mount up and ride out. If I see you on my property again, I won't wait for conversation. I'll shoot on sight. For a moment, Maylene thought Cain might refuse, might force this to its bloody conclusion, but the man's survival instinct finally overrode his pride. He turned to his horse, climbed into the saddle with stiff, angry movements. Carter, Let's go. The foreman emerged from cover slowly, his rifle still trained on Gideon. This ain't right, Mr. Cain. We can still... I said let's go. Carter mounted reluctantly, and the three of them rode out, Cain in front, his back rigid with fury. They moved slowly, refusing to show fear, but they moved nonetheless. Maylene and Gideon stood in the snow, weapons ready, watching until the riders disappeared over the southern rise. Only when they were completely out of sight did Gideon lower the Winchester. "They're gone," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "They're actually gone." Maylene's legs chose that moment to give out. She sat down hard in the snow, the revolver falling from her nerveless fingers, her whole body shaking with delayed reaction. They'd survived. Impossibly. Against all odds, they'd survived. Gideon knelt beside her, his good arm going around her shoulders. "You did good. Better than good. You were magnificent. I was terrified. So was I. Terror doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. What you do despite the terror, that's what matters." He helped her to her feet, both of them swaying slightly with exhaustion. "Come on, we need to check if anything survived the fire, then figure out our next move." They walked to the ruins of the cabin together, picking through ash and charred wood. Most everything was destroyed: clothing, furniture, supplies, all reduced to carbon and memory. But in the stone fireplace, which had survived intact, they found a small miracle. The metal box where Gideon kept his important papers had protected its contents. His father's pocket watch, slightly scorched but still ticking. The deed to his land. And $200 in gold coins, enough to rebuild. "It's something," Gideon said, pocketing the watch and the money. "More than I expected." They salvaged what little else remained. Some tools from the barn, blankets that had been stored in a trunk, a few pots and pans. Meager possessions to start a life with, but they'd both started with less before. As they worked, Maylene became aware of Gideon watching her, his expression thoughtful. "What?" she asked. "I was just thinking about what you said last night, about partnership, about facing the world together." He set down the hammer he'd been examining. "You still mean that?" Her heart skipped. "Yes." "Then we should make it official, proper." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, the pocket watch. "This was my father's. My mother gave it to him on their wedding day. I gave it to Sarah when I proposed." He held it out to her. "I know it's not a ring, and it's not romantic, but it's perfect." Maylene took the watch, feeling the weight of it, the history it carried. "But Gideon, are you sure? You don't have to do this just because of what I said. I don't want you to feel obligated. I'm not doing this out of obligation." He took her free hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. "I'm doing this because somewhere between pulling you out of that blizzard and standing beside you against Cain, I realized something. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living. And I want to keep living, with you, building something new from these ashes." Tears burned behind Maylene's eyes. But these were different from the ones she'd shed in despair. These were tears of relief, of hope, of something she barely dared name. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gideon smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face and made him look 10 years younger. "We'll need to go to Fort Collins, find a preacher or a judge, make it legal and binding so Cain can't challenge it." He paused. "And we'll need supplies for the journey. Food, warm clothes, maybe a wagon if we can afford it." "The Johnsons," Maylene said suddenly. "They offered to help. Maybe they'd loan us what we need." "Maybe it's worth asking." He looked around at the destroyed ranch, his expression both sad and determined. "We'll have to leave this place, start fresh somewhere else. I've got the deed so I can sell the land eventually, use the money to set up wherever we end up." "Does that bother you? Leaving? 5 years ago it would have destroyed me. This place was everything, my home, my memories, my connection to Sarah and James." He squeezed her hand. "But I'm starting to understand that holding on to ghosts just keeps you trapped in the past. They wouldn't want that for me. Sarah would tell me to move forward, to find new happiness." He met her eyes. "And I think I have." They stood together in the ruins, two survivors who'd found each other through circumstance and chosen each other through will. The ranch was gone, but they remained. Scarred, exhausted, but alive and free. A sound made them both turn. Horses approaching from the north. Maylene's hand went to the revolver at her belt, but Gideon touched her arm. Wait, that's not Cain. He was right. The riders that emerged from the tree line were familiar. Eric Johnson on the lead horse, followed by 3 of his sons, all armed and looking ready for trouble. Gideon, Eric called, spurring his horse forward. We saw the smoke yesterday, came as soon as we could get through. He pulled up short, taking in the destroyed cabin, the 2 soot-stained survivors. What happened here? Barrett Cain happened, Gideon said. He came for Maylene. We convinced him to leave. Convinced him? Eric looked at the ruins, then at Maylene and Gideon, putting the pieces together. You fought him off? Just the 2 of you? More or less. Ingrid appeared then, riding up on a sturdy mare with a pack horse in tow. She dismounted quickly, her eyes sharp with concern, and immediately went to Maylene. Child, you're hurt. Both of you, you look half dead. She started unpacking supplies, food, blankets, medical supplies. Eric, help me set up a shelter. These 2 need rest and proper care. What followed was a blur of activity. The Johnsons took charge with the calm efficiency of people accustomed to frontier emergencies. Within an hour, they'd erected a tent near the barn, built a fire, and had hot food cooking. Ingrid tended to Gideon's wounded arm properly, cleaning and rebandaging it with professional skill. You're lucky, she pronounced. Another inch and the bullet would have hit the artery. As it is, you'll heal clean if you don't do anything stupid. I'll try to avoid stupidity, Gideon said dryly. Eric sat down beside them, his weathered face serious. Cain won't let this go. You know that, yeah? He'll be back, probably with more men, maybe with the marshal like he threatened. I know. Gideon explained their plan to leave, to go to Fort Collins and start over. Eric nodded slowly. Smart, and I'll help. I can loan you a wagon, supplies for the journey. You can pay me back when you're settled. He paused. There's something else you should know. Word's already spreading about what happened here, how you stood up to Cain, how you fought him off. People are talking. That's not good, Gideon said. Actually, it might be. Eric leaned forward. Cain's been pushing people around for years, taking what he wants, using debt as a weapon, and most folks just accept it because he's powerful. But you didn't. You showed that he can be defied, that his power isn't absolute. He smiled. You're a hero to some people now, including some who matter. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who protected someone who needed protecting. That's exactly what makes you a hero, Ingrid said quietly. She was sitting with Maylene, helping her clean the soot from her hair. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. They spent 2 days with the Johnsons, recovering and preparing for the journey to Fort Collins. Eric was true to his word, providing a sturdy wagon, 2 horses, and enough supplies to last the trip. Ingrid packed extra blankets and food, plus warm clothes that would actually fit Maylene properly. Consider it a wedding gift, she said with a knowing smile when Maylene tried to protest. On the morning of the 3rd day, they said their goodbyes. Eric clasped Gideon's hand firmly. You're a good man, Hale. Don't let this world make you forget that. I'll try not to. Ingrid hugged Maylene tightly. You're stronger than you know, child. You survived an ocean, a storm, and a war. Whatever comes next, you'll survive that too. Thank you, Maylene whispered, for everything. They climbed into the wagon, Gideon taking the reins with his good arm, Maylene sitting beside him on the bench. As they pulled away from the ruins of the ranch, Maylene looked back one last time at the place where she'd nearly died and instead found life. The charred timbers of the cabin stood like a monument to everything they'd lost and everything they'd won. She thought she should feel sadness at leaving, but all she felt was hope. Ready? Gideon asked. Ready. They headed north toward Fort Collins, toward marriage and a fresh start. Behind them, the past smoldered in ash. Ahead, the future waited, unknown and uncertain, but theirs to shape. And for 2 people who'd both learned that survival sometimes meant burning down everything you thought you needed and building something new from the ruins, that uncertainty felt like freedom. The wagon rolled forward, carrying them away from the battlefield and toward something that felt remarkably like home. The road to Fort Collins stretched before them like a promise written in snow and frozen earth. Maylene sat beside Gideon on the wagon bench, wrapped in the warm coat Ingrid had given her, watching the landscape transform as they left the isolated valleys behind and moved toward civilization. They traveled for 3 days, moving slowly to spare the horses and to accommodate Gideon's injured arm. Each night they made camp beneath the stars, sharing the warmth of a small fire and the quiet companionship that had become as natural as breathing. They talked about small things, the weather, the route, the condition of the horses, and occasionally about larger things, like what kind of life they wanted to build once they reached their destination. "I'm thinking somewhere with good water," Gideon said on the second night, stirring the beans cooking over their fire. "Maybe near a river. Land that's not too rocky, good for farming or raising cattle." "Not another isolated ranch?" Maylene asked. He shook his head. "No, I spent 5 years alone, and I'm done with isolation. Somewhere closer to people, to community. Somewhere we can have neighbors without riding half a day to see them. I'd like that." She poured coffee from the pot, handed him a cup. "And I'd like to learn more. Reading and writing in English, I mean. I can speak well enough, but the written words still confuse me sometimes. There are schools in Fort Collins, teachers. You could hire someone to tutor you." He paused. "Or I could teach you. Sarah taught me how to read properly. I only knew the basics before we married." The ease with which he spoke of his late wife surprised Maylene. There was sadness there still, but it had softened into something gentler, memory instead of grief. "I'd like that," she said, "learning from you." They fell into comfortable silence, eating their simple meal and watching the fire burn low. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and the horses shifted nervously in their picket line. "Tomorrow we'll reach Fort Collins," Gideon said. "First thing we'll do is find someone to marry us. Make it legal and binding before Cain has any chance to interfere. Do you think he'll follow us there?" "Maybe. Probably." Gideon set down his empty plate. "But Fort Collins isn't his territory. He's got power in the settlement because he controls the economy there. In a real town with real law, he's just another businessman. He'll have to play by actual rules." Maylene hoped he was right, but doubt gnawed at her. Cain had seemed like the type of man who made his own rules wherever he went, who bent the world to his will through money and violence and sheer force of personality. But she'd also learned something important in the past month. Men like Cain only had power over people who believed they had no choice. And she'd chosen to fight, chosen to stand beside Gideon against impossible odds, chosen to claim her own life rather than let Cain steal it. That choice had changed everything. They reached Fort Collins late on the 4th day, the town appearing on the horizon like a cluster of wooden boxes scattered across the prairie. It was larger than the settlement Maylene had fled. Proper streets laid out in a grid, substantial buildings made of milled lumber instead of rough logs, signs of prosperity and permanence everywhere she looked. "It's grown since I was here last," Gideon observed, guiding the wagon down the main street. "Must be 300 people now, maybe more." People turned to stare as they passed. A weathered rancher and a Chinese woman in men's clothes made an unusual sight, and Maylene felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. Some gazes were merely curious, others held judgment, disapproval, or worse. But she kept her head high, her expression calm. She'd survived too much to be cowed by stares. Gideon pulled up outside a building with a sign reading Marshal's Office and climbed down stiffly, his wounded arm still bound in the sling Ingrid had fashioned. "Wait here," he said. "I need to report what happened at the ranch. Make sure our version goes on record before Cain tries to spin his own story." Maylene watched him disappear inside, then turned her attention to the street around her. A woman in a fine dress passed by, clutching her daughter's hand and pointedly not looking at Maylene. Two men outside the saloon whispered to each other, their eyes hard and cold. A shopkeeper sweeping his front steps paused to stare before going back to his work. She'd known this would be difficult. Chinese weren't welcome in most American towns, barely tolerated in the best of circumstances. Add to that the scandal of a Chinese woman traveling alone with a white man, and she'd painted a target on both their backs. But Gideon had chosen this anyway, had chosen her anyway. That knowledge steadied her, made the hostile stares bearable. Gideon emerged from the marshal's office 20 minutes later, his expression grim. "What did he say?" Maylene asked as he climbed back onto the wagon. "He took my statement. Seemed sympathetic enough about Cain burning us out, but he guided the horses toward what looked like a boarding house. He also warned me that harboring a Chinese woman who's wanted for debt evasion could bring trouble. Said Cain's been sending telegrams trying to get other lawmen on his side. So even here, Cain has reach. Some. But the marshal also said that without proper legal documentation of the debt, which Cain doesn't have, there's nothing legally binding. The marriage will protect you completely. He pulled the wagon to a stop. Let's get a room for the night, then find someone to perform the ceremony tomorrow. The boarding house keeper was a stern-faced woman in her 60s who looked Maylin up and down with barely concealed disapproval. Separate rooms, she said flatly. We're to be married tomorrow, Gideon explained. But yes, separate rooms until then. The woman's expression softened slightly. I suppose that's proper. $2 for the night, each room. Breakfast included. They paid and received their keys, rooms on opposite ends of the upstairs hallway, as far apart as the building allowed. The woman wasn't taking any chances with propriety. Maylin's room was small but clean, with a real bed and a window overlooking the street. She washed with water from the basin, changed into the dress Ingrid had packed for her. Simple calico, but it fit properly and marked her clearly as a woman rather than someone in borrowed men's clothes. A knock came at her door just as she finished braiding her hair. It's me, Gideon's voice called. She opened the door to find him cleaned up as well, his beard trimmed, his hair slicked back with water. He'd changed into what must have been his best remaining clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt, slightly worn but respectable. I found a judge who will marry us tomorrow morning, he said. Judge Morrison, works out of the courthouse. He said 10 o'clock, if that suits you. It suits me. Maylin hesitated, then asked the question that had been building since they'd left the ranch. Gideon, are you certain about this? Once we're married, there's no going back. You'll be tied to me, to all the trouble that comes with me. He stepped closer, his gray-blue eyes serious. I've been thinking about that a lot on the road, about whether I'm making this choice for the right reasons or if I'm just trying to save you out of some misplaced sense of duty. He took her hand. And I've realized something. Duty got us this far. Duty made me pull you out of the storm. Duty made me stand against Cain. But somewhere along the way, duty became something else. What did it become? Respect, admiration, partnership. He smiled slightly. Maybe even the beginning of love, though I'm rusty enough at that I'm not entirely sure what it feels like anymore. Maylin felt warmth bloom in her chest, fragile and precious. I think it feels like this, like knowing someone will stand beside you when the world turns cruel, like choosing each other every day even when it's difficult. Then that's what we'll do, choose each other every day. He squeezed her hand gently. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we start our new life. That night, Maylin lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind too full for sleep. Tomorrow, she would marry a man she'd known for barely more than a month, a stranger who'd become the most important person in her life. Tomorrow, she would become Maylin Hale, with all the protection and possibility that name would bring. But beneath the practical considerations, beneath the strategy and survival, there was something else, a quiet joy, unexpected and genuine. She was marrying a good man who saw her as an equal, who'd proven his character in fire and blood. She was claiming a future she'd choose rather than one forced upon her. That was worth more than all the gold in California. Morning came with pale winter sunlight streaming through her window. Maylin dressed carefully in the calico dress, braided her hair with the ribbon Ingrid had tucked into the supplies, and studied herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. She looked different than the desperate refugee who'd fled into the blizzard. Older, harder, but also somehow more alive. The fear that had haunted her eyes had been replaced by something fiercer, a woman who'd fought for her freedom and won. Gideon was waiting in the hallway when she emerged, and the look on his face made her breath catch. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you. She took his offered arm. You look handsome. They walked to the courthouse together, drawing stares and whispers but ignoring them. The building was modest but solid, built of brick with a proper roof and glass windows. Judge Morrison's office was on the second floor, a cramped space packed with law books and papers. The judge himself was a small man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. He rose when they entered, extending his hand to Gideon. Mr. Hale, good to see you again. He turned to Maylin, his greeting equally warm. And you must be Miss Chen. Please, both of you, sit. They settled into the chairs across from his desk, and Morrison pulled out a thick book of legal forms. Now then, before we proceed, I need to ask a few questions. Mr. Hale, you are legally free to marry? No existing wife or legal impediments? My wife died 5 years ago. I'm free to marry. And Miss Chen, the same question applies to you. My husband died 2 months ago. I am free. Morrison made notes in his ledger. Good. Now, I understand there may be some complications regarding your marriage. A man named Barrett Cain has been making inquiries, claiming Miss Chen owes him a substantial debt. Maylene's stomach dropped. He's here? In Fort Collins? No, but he's sent representatives. Men asking questions, spreading rumors. Morrison set down his pen and looked at them both seriously. I want you to understand what you're walking into. This marriage will protect Miss Chen legally, but it may not protect either of you from social consequences. People talk. They judge. They can make life difficult in ways the law can't prevent. We understand, Gideon said. Do you? Because I've seen marriages destroyed by community pressure. I've seen good people driven out of towns because their neighbors decided they didn't belong. Morrison softened his tone. I'm not trying to discourage you. I just want you to enter this with clear eyes. Maylene spoke up, her voice steady. Judge Morrison, I have already been driven from my home, watched my husband die, fled into a blizzard to escape being sold like property, and fought off armed men who wanted to take my freedom. Whatever social consequences come from this marriage, I have faced worse. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then smiled. I believe you have, Miss Chen. Very well. He stood. Let's make this official. The ceremony was simple and quick, nothing like the elaborate wedding Maylene's parents had arranged for her first marriage. No guests, no celebration, just 3 people in a small office speaking words that would change everything. Do you, Gideon Hale, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. And do you, Maylene Chen, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. Morrison closed his book. Mr. Hale, you may kiss your bride if you wish. Gideon turned to her, question in his eyes, and Maylene nodded. He leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips, brief and chaste, but warm with promise. They signed the marriage certificate. Morrison added his seal and signature, and just like that, Maylene was a married woman again. But this time, the marriage was her choice, her decision, her future claimed rather than sold. Congratulations, Morrison said, handing them their copy of the certificate. I hope you'll find happiness together. They left the courthouse as husband and wife, the certificate tucked safely in Gideon's coat pocket. The winter sun seemed brighter somehow, the cold less biting. Well, Mrs. Hale, Gideon said, and she heard the smile in his voice. What would you like to do first? I'd like to... She never finished the sentence. A familiar voice cut across the street, stopping her cold. There she is! The thief who stole my property! Barrett Cain stood outside the marshal's office, flanked by Carter and 2 other men. But he wasn't alone. The marshal himself stood beside him, looking uncomfortable but official. Gideon's hand went to where his gun would normally be, but he'd left it at the boarding house to avoid looking threatening during the wedding. Maylene stepped closer to him, her heart hammering. That woman owes me money, Cain shouted, loud enough for half the street to hear. She's a fugitive and a thief. The marshal stepped forward, his hand on his gun belt. Mr. Hale, Miss Chen, I'm going to need you to come with me. We need to sort this matter out. Her name is Mrs. Hale now, Gideon said calmly. We were just married by Judge Morrison. You can verify that with him if you'd like. Cain's face went purple. Married? That doesn't change anything. She still owes me money. Actually, it changes everything, Morrison's voice called from the courthouse steps. The judge had followed them out and now descended toward the confrontation. Marshal Blake, as a married woman, any debts alleged to exist from before the marriage are not her responsibility. Her husband would have to agree to assume them, which I suspect he will not. Damn right I won't, Gideon said. Furthermore, Morrison continued, pulling papers from his coat, I took the liberty this morning of examining the debt claim Mr. Cain filed. It's poorly documented, lacks a signature from the alleged debtor, and contains several legal irregularities that would make it unenforceable in any legitimate court. Cain sputtered. That's a lie! The debt is real! Perhaps it was, Morrison said mildly, but without proper documentation, it's just your word. And your word, Mr. Cain, is not law. He turned to the marshal. I recommend you drop this matter, Blake. There's no legal standing for an arrest. The marshal looked between Morrison and Cain, clearly caught between the law and Cain's influence. For a long moment, Maylene thought he might side with Cain anyway, might arrest them just to avoid trouble. Then a new voice joined the conversation. I would also recommend you drop it, Marshal. Eric Johnson walked up the street with 3 of his sons, all armed, all looking ready for trouble. Behind them came other men, ranchers and farmers from the valleys around the settlement, 15 in all. Eric, the marshal said, surprised. What are you doing here? We came to support our friends. Gideon Hale stood up to a bully when most of us were too scared. He defended a woman who needed defending, and we're here to make sure he doesn't face consequences for doing the right thing. Eric looked at Cain directly. You want these 2, Barrett? You'll have to go through all of us. Cain's face twisted with rage, but even he could see the math. His 3 men against 20 armed settlers, with the judge and the law on the settlers' side. This isn't over, he hissed. I'll appeal to the territorial governor. I'll take this to federal court. You'll do whatever you want, Eric interrupted. But not here, not today. These people are under our protection now. He turned to the marshal. Unless you want to arrest 20 voters, Blake, I suggest you tell Mr. Cain to move along. The marshal's shoulders sagged. Mr. Cain, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. There's no legal basis for your claim, and I won't have a disturbance in my town. Your town? This is my... Cain stopped himself, breathing hard. Fine, fine. But mark my words, all of you. You've made a powerful enemy today, every last one of you. He stalked to his horse, Carter and his men following. They mounted and rode out, Cain's back rigid with fury, leaving defeated promises hanging in the air. When they were gone, the tension broke. The settlers relaxed, some even laughing with relief. Eric clapped Gideon on his good shoulder. Sorry we're late for the wedding. We rode hard when we heard Cain was in town. How did you know? Maylin asked. Ingrid has friends everywhere. One of them sent word yesterday that Cain was asking questions about you in Fort Collins. Eric grinned. We figured you might need backup. Thank you, Gideon said quietly. All of you. I won't forget this. Neither will we, one of the other ranchers said. What you did, standing up to Cain, fighting back, that took courage. Made us realize we've been letting him push us around too long. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. While this has been quite dramatic, I think the newlyweds might appreciate some time to themselves. Gentlemen, perhaps we could continue this conversation at the saloon? First round on me. The crowd dispersed good-naturedly, the settlers heading for drinks and warmth, leaving Maylene and Gideon standing on the courthouse steps. Well, Gideon said. That was eventful. Maylene laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep and relieved. Is everything in America this dramatic? Only the good parts. He offered his arm. Come on, Mrs. Hale, let's get some lunch. I'm buying. They found a small restaurant that served hot food and didn't seem to object to serving a Chinese woman. Over beef stew and fresh bread, they talked about practical things. Where to stay while they looked for land, how to stretch their limited funds, what kind of home they wanted to build. But beneath the practical talk, there was something else. A growing ease, a deepening comfort. They were married now, truly and legally bound, and with that binding came a strange sense of rightness. I was thinking, Gideon said, pushing his empty bowl aside. There's a valley about 20 miles north of here, good water, timber for building, close enough to town for supplies, but far enough for privacy. I looked at land there once, before Sarah died. Why didn't you buy it? It felt wrong somehow, like I'd be leaving her behind. He met Maylene's eyes. But maybe that was the problem. I spent 5 years living in the past, trying to hold on to something that was gone. Maybe it's time to build something new. I'd like to see this valley, Maylene said. They spent 3 more days in Fort Collins, making arrangements and gathering supplies. Gideon sold the deed to his burned ranch to a land speculator for less than it was worth, but enough to give them a real start. They bought tools, seeds, a small herd of cattle, and 2 good horses. Judge Morrison connected them with a lawyer who drew up papers establishing Maylene's legal status as a married woman, documents that would protect her if Cain tried any future legal maneuvering. And through it all, people watched, some with disapproval, some with curiosity, but others with something that looked like respect. Word had spread about their fight against Cain, about how they'd defended their home against impossible odds. They'd become a story, a tale people told in saloons and at dinner tables, the Chinese woman and the widower who'd stood together against tyranny. On the 4th day, they loaded their wagon and headed north toward the valley Gideon had described. The land was everything he'd promised, a wide meadow bordered by pine forest, a clear stream running through the middle, and mountains rising in the distance like sentinels. "It's beautiful," Maylene breathed. "It will be," Gideon corrected. "Right now it's just raw land, but we'll build something here, something that's ours." They made camp that first night beneath the stars, and as they sat by the fire, Gideon pulled out his father's pocket watch, the one he'd given to Maylene as a proposal. "You should keep this," she said. "No." He pressed it into her hands. "It's yours now, a reminder that time doesn't stop, even when we think it should. We move forward, we build new lives, we choose to keep living." Maylene turned the watch over in her hands, feeling the weight of generations. "My mother gave me a jade bracelet when I left China. Cain's men took it when they caught me. I have nothing from my old life." "Then we'll make new traditions, start new histories." Gideon gestured at the valley around them. "Everything we build here, we build together. Equal partners." "Equal partners," Maylene agreed. Over the following weeks, they worked side by side to establish their new home. Gideon taught Maylene how to fell trees and notch logs for a cabin. She taught him dishes from her homeland, adapting them to frontier ingredients. They built slowly, carefully, creating something solid that would withstand whatever storms came. Eric and Ingrid visited regularly, bringing supplies and news. Other settlers came too, offering help with the heavy work, bringing housewarming gifts, slowly incorporating the Hales into the community. And gradually, Maylene felt something she hadn't felt since leaving Canton: belonging. Not the belonging of obligation or tradition, but the belonging of choice. These people had seen her at her worst and still accepted her, had watched her fight and deemed her worthy. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing green to the valley. The cabin was finished, modest but sturdy, with a real floor and tight walls and windows that let in light. They planted a garden, the first crop of what would become many. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maylene and Gideon sat on the porch of their new home. His arm had healed completely, and she'd learned enough English to read simple books. They'd built a life from nothing, brick by brick, day by day. "Do you ever regret it?" Gideon asked. "Leaving China, coming here, everything that happened." Maylene thought about the question carefully. She thought about her parents, her village, the life she'd left behind. She thought about Jianhong and his broken promises, about Cain and his cruelty, about the blizzard that had nearly killed her. "I regret the suffering," she said finally, "but I don't regret where it led me. If I hadn't come to America, I never would have met you, never would have discovered I could be strong, never would have learned that I could choose my own path." "You were always strong," Gideon said. "You just needed the chance to prove it." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "And you? Do you regret taking in a half-frozen stranger?" "Not for a second." He kissed the top of her head. "You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "A reason to care about tomorrow." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged one by one above their valley. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The cattle lowed softly in their pen. The stream murmured its endless song, their home, their land, their life. It wasn't the life Maylene had imagined when she'd left China. It wasn't the life Gideon had planned when he'd married his first wife, but it was theirs, built through courage and choice and the determination to face the world together rather than alone. "I love you," Maylene said quietly, the words still unfamiliar in English but feeling right nonetheless. Gideon's arm tightened around her. "I love you too." They were simple words, but they carried the weight of everything they'd survived to reach this moment. The storm, the siege, The fear and the fighting and the desperate gamble that had paid off against all odds. Two survivors who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their old lives. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them, Gideon and Maylin Hale sat together on their porch, husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word, facing whatever future would come with the quiet certainty that they would face it together. The storm had passed. The battle was won. The journey that had begun with a desperate woman fleeing into a blizzard had ended with two people finding home in each other. And in the valley beneath the Wyoming stars, that was more than enough. It was everything.